Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hands on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Be opened." And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. But the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute to speak."
Okay, so on Wednesday night, this is what we did. On Wednesday night, we talked about starting at Mark chapter 4 and verse 35 all the way through the end of chapter 5. This is a lesson, I think, that is really important when you read the Gospels. We're learning how to read the Gospels in the way that they were written, in the way that we're supposed to understand them. I think a lot of times you would open up your Bible and you would read through one of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you would think, first Jesus went here, and this is what he said, and this is what he did, and then Jesus went here, and this is what he said, and this is what he did. And we think, okay, Mark, the gospel writer where we are this morning, he just wrote down a list of everything that Jesus did, and then he went here, and then he did this, and then he did that, and we're just reading a record of it. That's not what the Gospels are. The Gospels have clumped stories together, and oftentimes they're not in chronological order. They've clumped stories together for the purpose of making a point. And so the point that we talked about on Wednesday night in Bible class was 4 stories. Jesus and his disciples are crossing to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and there's a big storm, and the disciples get scared. And then in chapter 5 and verses 1 through 20, there's the man who is possessed by a demon, and he's super scary, and nobody can do anything to help him. And then there's a sandwich here. In 21 to about 23, there is a man named Jairus who says this in verse 23, "My little daughter's at the point of death," and he asks Jesus to come fix his problem. And that story's broken up from 25 to about 34 of a woman with a blood flow, a blood disorder, and Jesus heals her and fixes her problem. And then we're back to the Jairus story in verse 35, where some people come to Jairus in verse 35 and they say, "Your daughter's dead," and Jesus says, "Don't worry about it, I'll take care of it." And so I would just want to do one thing. I don't want to rehash that entire thing that we did on Wednesday night. On Wednesday night, we did 3 points. We all have the same problem. These are 4 completely separate stories, but everybody in the story has the same problem: desperation and fear, and they're all facing death, and that's us. We all have zero hope of anything because we're all facing death. There's nothing but desperation. You see people in our world doing everything they possibly can to avoid death and to escape the consequence that literally every human has ever experienced in this world. And so we all have the same problem: desperation and fear and death approaching the end. At the end of that story, point number 3 on Wednesday night was salvation. Jesus fixed all their problems. But the middle is what I want us to talk about today. The solution to all of our problems. We all have the same problem, and the solution to all of our problems is the same. It's faith. So let's start with the 3rd and the 4th story. In chapter 5 and verse 22, this man Jairus comes to Jesus and fell at his feet, 23, implored him earnestly, and he says, "Come and lay your hands on my daughter so that she may be made well and live." That's the kind of faith that we're looking for. The kind of faith who looks at Jesus and says, "That's a guy who can solve my problem." And that's the point, right? I don't know. This is all introduction. I'm getting to something here. But already my stomach turns over as I talk about this a little bit, because that's the faith that I want. I want the kind of faith that without flaw When confronted with any sort of issue or problem whatsoever, my mind is, Jesus can fix my problem. That's where I want my heart to be. It's not always there, but that's where I want my heart to be. And so this is what Jesus says to the guy. They come in verse 35 and they say, your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? 36, overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, this is what he says. This is what I want. Do not fear, only believe. The solution for all of our problems is faith and trust in Jesus. The same thing is true with the woman in the middle in verse 28. She's got this problem. Nobody can help her. She says, if I can touch even his garment, I will be made well. She has absolute faith that that is the answer to her problem in life. And she goes to him. She's made well. In verse 34, Jesus said, daughter, your faith has made you well. That's the faith that I want. The first two stories, let's do story number 2, the Gerasene demoniac in chapter 5. This man's hopeless. Nobody can do anything for this guy. And Jesus fixes his problem. Jump down to the end of verse 18. After his problem was solved, it says he begged Jesus that he might be with him. That's the faith I'm looking for. I want the kind of faith and the trust in Jesus that says, you fix my problem, I will follow you anywhere you go. I'll do anything. And he went. Jesus said, no, you need to stay home, tell your friends. And he did. Verse 20, he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone marveled. That's the faith. It's not just faith that believes and hopes there's the solution to my problem. It's the kind of faith who says, that's my guy. I will follow him anywhere and I will do anything. That's why I'm talking about this today. These stories aren't just stories to learn something from in the Bible and say, hey, cool, that's a neat story. I want the kind of faith that's real life faith when I go into the workplace or when I go into school or when I'm living my life or when I'm watching Netflix. Like every single thing about who I am is now governed and driven by this unyielding faith in Jesus. That's the faith I'm looking for. And the reason why I saved the first story for last is because the people who should have had it the most, Jesus' apostles, are the one group of people in this story who did not have it. If you will look in verse 40, they wake Jesus up and they say in the middle of the storm, we're dying, Jesus, save us, do something. We talked about this in class. That's good that they went to Jesus. They knew where to go. But Jesus said to them, why are you afraid? Don't you have any faith? Have you still no faith? And that's what I want to avoid. I want the faith that governs my life and that directs everything about who I am and what I do. And I would assume that you do too. But here's the deal. We're all at different spots in this faith. I know good and well. I know it's true in this room because I'm often the guy. I know good and well that we read these stories and so much the stuff that's in my heart, the trust and the faith that I have in Jesus does not match the stuff that I'm reading about in the story. And my aim and my goal is, how do I get to that? That's what I want to know. If I don't have a PowerPoint this morning. If you're writing notes, this is the title for the top of your paper. That faith that we're talking about is a process. It's not something that just happens. It's a process. And it happens over time because you're trying and striving for it. These are the two things that we're going to talk about at the end of this lesson. It happens because we are asking God for faith. At least the apostles did that. At least they knew where to go to ask for help. And so that's going to be us. And lastly, we'll do this. This is the last thing we'll do today. That faith that's a process that we want to build up to, that I ultimately want to have. One of the ways that we're going to get it is because we're going to help each other to get there. So that's what we're doing today. If you want to look over at Mark chapter 7, this corresponds with our Bible reading. If you're following along in the Bible reading plan that we sent out, on Friday, you should have finished Mark chapter 10. And so we're going to cover that chunk. Not everything. I'm not even going to read this. Mark chapter 7 and verse 31. If you're writing notes, then this is what you need to know about this. It's like a sandwich. Remember, this is not Jesus went here and did this, Jesus went here and did this, Jesus went here and did this. That is not what the Gospels are. It's a chunk of stories that are woven together for the purpose of making a point, and we're looking for that point and how it is going to change my life and affect my life. And so this is where it starts. It starts in 731, where it's a deaf mute. There's a man who can't hear and he can't speak. And while that story is true, that Jesus really did heal a man who was not able to hear and not able to speak, that's a true story. It's included in the gospel because we're making a point about the faith that we've been talking about today. So often, those of us who claim to be God's people, we're deaf and we can't speak. I can't hear it. So often in the Bible, not hearing is I don't understand it. And if you don't understand it, you sure can't say it to other people. And so the result of this story is about verse 35. His ears were open, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. That's not just a story about a deaf guy who can't talk. It's what we're looking for. I want to be the guy who understands Jesus and understands what's going on so that I can share it with other people. That's where the story starts. Go over to chapter 10. This is where the story ends. This chunk of text ends in chapter 10. And we'll see a couple of these different guys. A couple of deaf guys, a couple of blind guys. Chapter 10 and verse 46. Let's just read this one quick. They came to Jericho, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples, with a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting at the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. That's the thing that's good. He knows where to go. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent, but he cried out all the more. He would not be stopped. Jesus is the answer to the problem. He would not be stopped. Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man and said, take heart, get up. He's calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said, what do you want me to do for you? And he said, the blind man said, Rabbi, let me receive my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way. Your faith has made you well. There it is again. But this story is embedded in another story of a guy who can't see, who puts his faith and his hope and trust in Jesus. And the story is about, now I can see. That's what we're after. That's the thing that we want. So let's just survey a couple of these stories real quick. Chapter 7. Go back to chapter 7. Let's do 8. We already read 7. Chapter 8. Here's the problem. Please don't just see the problem in the text. This is my problem. This is our problem. In chapter 8 and verses 1 through 10, just look at the heading. Jesus feeds 4,000 people. He does a miracle, super awesome. Lots of people see it and know about it. Hey, this must be the Son of God. He did this great miracle. And so there's 3 parts to this story. That's part 1. Part 2 starts in verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And Jesus sighed deeply. If you're a parent, you know about that sigh. What is wrong with you people? I just fed 4,000 people. This isn't even the first time I did it. The first time I did it was 5,000. And they come and they're like, show me a sign so that we can really see who you are. And Jesus goes, He sighs at these people. Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly, I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left him and he got in the boat and he went to the other side. And so we're like, oh yeah, that's the Pharisees. We expect that from them, right? Jesus does a sign. The Pharisees, even in spite of this sign, say, hey, show us a sign so we can really see who you are. And we're like, yeah, but they're Pharisees. We expect that. But verse 14, this is the third part. Here's my problem. This is why this sermon is a real sermon. It's not just about something in the Bible. This is my problem. Now they had forgotten to bring bread. This is the disciples. This isn't the Pharisees that we're talking about. We expect this nonsense from the Pharisees. This is the disciples. They forgot to bring bread. They only had one loaf with them in the boat, and he cautioned them, saying, "Watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not perceive and understand yet?" The Pharisees saw Jesus feed 5,000 and then 4,000. They didn't get it, and we say, yeah, they're Pharisees. But Jesus is saying to his disciples, how are we still having a problem with this? Don't you understand yet? And besides, that's not even what I'm talking about. He gets on, are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? Having ears, do you not hear? We're dealing with blind and deaf people. That's why the stories about blind and deaf people keep popping up in this section over and over again. Because the disciples, and in this story, I am the disciple, even in spite of being somebody who goes to Jesus for my salvation. I read about him every day. I talk about him every Sunday. So often, in real life, over and over again, I'm just blind and deaf. I don't get it. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. And so Jesus says to this group of people, come on, guys. Verse 21, he says to them, do you not yet understand? That's my problem. That's what we're talking about. There's another thing, and then we'll start to get to it. One more thing. In the next story, there's another section of 3 things. Let's follow these 3 things. Starting in verse 22, chapter 8 and verse 22. It's another blind guy who gets healed. I think this one is probably more me than anybody. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes, he laid his hands on him and he asked, do you see anything? And he looked up and he said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him off to his home and said, don't enter the village. So here's a story of this guy. I get this story because you would be like, Jesus heals the guy, and he says, we good? And he says, well, everything looks like a tree. And it's like, what? A tree? Except for this. In the morning before I put my contacts in my eyes, everything looks like a tree. It's all blurry and fuzzy on the edge, and I can see, but I probably shouldn't drive. I mean, on my license, it says I shouldn't drive. Sometimes I do to go to Diet Coke or something, but I've never killed anybody yet. But that's what it is. And the idea is he comes to Jesus and he says, heal me. And Jesus says, here you go. And he says, I'm starting to see, but everything's kind of fuzzy. And then Jesus says, I'm going to fix your problem. And now he sees everything clearly. And you don't read that story and say, cool story. You read about what happens next. What happens next in verse 27, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say the prophets. And he asked him, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered him, you are the Christ. Okay. Peter can see who Jesus is. But then we read the third story in this section, and what we come to find out is that his vision is just a little bit hazy. He says with his words, you are the Christ, but he's not seeing it clearly yet. It's not clear. In verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribe and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside. I laugh every time I read about this story. Can you imagine Peter? Here's Jesus, who he just said, you're the Messiah that we've been waiting for. And Peter goes over to Jesus and he's like, hey, come over here. I don't think you know what you're talking about. Peter's the guy who's going to straighten it out. So Peter goes to Jesus, took him aside. It's hilarious. He began to rebuke him, but turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Peter could see who Jesus was, but he didn't see clearly. It was fuzzy around the outside and the edges. It looked like a tree walking around. And so here's where I am. I want to be the guy who knows where the answer to my spiritual problems especially, where the answer to my problems are. Jesus is the answer. I want to be that woman who says, if only I can touch the edge of his clothes. I know so much that he's the answer. If only I can touch his clothes, I'll be made well. That's the faith that I want to have. But so often, I'm the disciples in the boat, and the storm is raging all around me, and I say, I'm afraid, and I don't have any faith. It's just the real life thing. Like you can see that part of me sometimes in the way that I talk. One more story, then we'll get to it. This is the end. This is the last story in Mark. Read the whole section of Mark. We can't do it this morning. We don't have time for it. But start with me in chapter 9. I'm going to start reading verse 17. Someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute." Look at this. I mean, it's a story. Read the story for what it is. It's a story about a kid who can't speak. He's possessed by a demon, and he's got lots of other problems because of this demon. But the problem is, here's a kid that doesn't know the way to talk. And that's kind of my problem sometimes. Here, he's got a problem. He's mute. Verse 18. This demon, when it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams and grinds his teeth, becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able. And he answered them. Look, this is our theme. Jesus looks around and he says, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you?" Jesus says, your problem is your faith. All throughout this whole section, that's been the same problem. And don't just read about it in the book. That's my problem. So often, my problem is my faith, or my lack of my faith. I'm not to the spot where that woman is, where I need to be, where I want to be. My problem is my faith. And so Jesus looks around. Hey, these guys can't fix this problem. And he says, you don't have faith. That's what you need. You don't have the thing that you need, the faith. That's the solution to your problems. And so Jesus says, bring him to me. Verse 20. They brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell to the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood, and it has often cast him into the fire and into water to destroy him." Listen to this. If there's ever been a guy in the Bible that I see myself in, it's this guy. Jesus. I mean, every single one of us, like, we would go to the ends of the earth to help our kid. Our kid is in some sort of mess like this. I'll do whatever I have to do. And here's this guy with a problem with his kid, and he goes to Jesus and he says, "You are the solution to my problem." But listen to what he says to Jesus. Where am I? Verse 20. They brought the boy to him, the spirit. Immediately it convulsed the boy. How long has he been? From childhood. Verse 22. It often cast him into the fire and the water to destroy him. Here it is. You can highlight one of these words. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Do you see the problem? The guy comes to Jesus and he says, if you can do something for my son. And that's what Jesus says. That's how Jesus responds. He says, if you can. What do you mean, if you can? That's me. I'm that guy who goes to Jesus. I'm like, there's the answer to my problem. I'm going to go to Jesus and I say, here's my problem, Jesus. I got this problem with my soul. I got this problem with my life. I got this problem with my mouth. I got this problem with my eyes. And I go to Jesus and I say, if you can fix my problem. And Jesus says, if you can, how long are we going to do this faith conversation? And so you see it over and over and over again. This is what Jesus says to the guy, I lost my spot, sorry. If you can, all things, I'm in 23, all things are possible for the one who believes. There's the faith. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, this is number one. That's the body of our lesson. We looked at the text. What's my takeaway? Takeaway number one. There's one way to get it. This is what the guy said. I do believe. Help my unbelief. Do you see yourself in that? That's me when I come to Jesus and I fall on the ground and I say, I'm doing the best I can. I need help for the rest. Would you pay attention tomorrow at work? And we've left church. We come together. We sing songs. Super awesome. Adam does a great job. And we're going to visit. We'll stay. And we'll leave. And, probably this afternoon we'll go home. And we'll come back to church again tonight. And we'll be all right. And then you're going to go to work tomorrow. And something will happen. I don't know what it is. It might be something that comes out of your mouth. And you'll think to yourself, that's not what I'm supposed to be. I'm not supposed to talk like that. Or you'll go somewhere, or you'll be in some sort of unethical situation in the workplace. Something will happen tomorrow. I don't know what it is, but something will happen tomorrow. This is your response. I believe in you. I'm not all the way there. Please, would you help me to fill in the gap? That's our response. Turn over to Luke chapter 17. Leave your finger here. Leave your finger in Mark chapter 9. We'll come back. But look at Luke 17. There's another example of this. In Luke chapter 17, probably we should, I don't know, we won't read all of this because we're running out of time. But chapter 17 and verse 1 gives us the context of this situation. Jesus said to his disciples, temptations to sin are sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they come. Jesus says to his followers, it's not like when you become a Christian, everything's just great and you sail smoothly along in life and you do everything you're supposed to do. He's prepping his disciples and he says, you are going to be tempted to sin. And he talks about this throughout 2, 3, and 4. And look at their response in verse 5. Their response, the apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith. Can that be our prayer today? Can that be our prayer today and on our tongue tomorrow and for the rest of the week when you're confronted with the thing that is clearly you not having the faith of the woman who just wanted to touch the edge of Jesus' clothes and said you're the disciples in the boat and you're like, Jesus is my guy, but I still don't believe him to take care of this problem. Can this be our prayer? I do believe, but help my unbelief. Or what the apostles prayed here, increase my faith. God, would you please help me to fill the gap between where I am and where I want to be, where I need to be. That's number one. Help my unbelief. Number 2, and then we'll be done. Since you're in Luke 17, let's read this. Do you know where the answer is? Starting in verse 1, Luke 17:1. Temptation to sin are sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were cast into the sea than that he should cause one of these little ones to sin. Pay attention to yourselves. That's it. That's tomorrow. Pay attention to yourselves. But then he says, if your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times in a day and turns to you 7 times, saying, I repent, you must forgive him. And the apostle said to the Lord, increase our faith. The prayer is not just a prayer to God to say, increase our faith. The prayer is, Jay, I told you that I'm having this problem, and you're the guy to help me with it. Whenever I start to freak out, Jay is the guy who says, hey, listen, we're going to be the woman who wanted to touch the edge of his clothes, not the disciples in the boat. We don't just do this church thing like what we're here for right now. It's not just church thing because it's Sunday and we all came together. Part of what we're doing is helping each other to fill the gap between where we are and where we need to be. Let's look at one more passage, and then we'll do the invitation and be done. Look over at Galatians chapter 6. I like to come to Galatians chapter 6 because this is, only my opinion, this is the worst chapter division in the entire Bible. We say, I'm going to start in chapter 6 and verse 1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. So this is saying, hey, you got a problem? I'll help you with your problem. But I'm going to watch out for myself too, not thinking that I'm arrogant or better than anybody else because I'm helping you with your problem. I'm going to help you and then you're going to help me. That's what this passage is about. But that chapter division might cause you to think, oh, hey, that's the start of a new thing. It's not. It starts back in chapter 5 and verse 16. I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. In verse 19, he says, these are the works of the flesh. And he lists them. And then he says, these are the fruit of the Spirit. This is what you're supposed to be doing. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. That's the fruit of the Spirit. And so he says, don't live by the works of the flesh. Instead, live and demonstrate and produce the fruit of the Spirit. And the very next word in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1 is, and to help each other. Help each other to fill the gap between where you are and where you need to be. And you help me to fill in that gap between where I am and where I need to be. And so, faith is a process. If you've been a Christian for a long time and you're not where you need to be, it's not the end of the world. So long as you're willing to start taking steps to get to where you need to be. And to ask God, help my unbelief. And to rely on each other in this church family, other Christians. Hold up my hands. Help me to fill in that gap. That's what we're about. That's what we should be doing. If you're here this morning and you're not a Christian, you know, this story that we've been talking about today is what Christianity is. Christianity is the person who says, I have a problem with my soul. The problem is sin and separation from God. And Jesus, faith in Jesus, Jesus is the answer to my problem. I'm going to go to him. And those 4 stories we talked about on Wednesday night, salvation was the result. If you're here today and you have that faith, maybe it's blurry around the outside, but you've got that faith that Jesus is the answer to your problem. And you're willing to repent of your sins, to turn away from those things that have created the separation in the first place, to do what the Scripture talks about. Baptism. Baptism is the thing that we call it, but baptism is, this guy is dead. And so what do you do with dead people? You bury them. I bury the old dead guy, and when I come up out of that grave, I'm like Peter who says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and I'm going to do as best I can to fill in that gap between where I am and where I need to be. If we can help you with that today, come forward as we sing the invitation song.